Hello, welcome to our final chapter. You're doing really well, so just stick with it now. In the first section of this chapter is all about employment law and the implications of whether you're an employee or being self-employed. And then once we've covered all the chapters, all the topics to do with employment, we'll look at data protection as well. So, first of all, employee status and its significance. Well, first of all, a bit of terminology. If you are an employee, and most of you probably are, you will have a contract of service. That's an employment contract to you and me. If you are a self-employed person, you will have what we call a contract for services. So if you employ a builder to come and do some work for you at home, that builder will give you a contract for services, setting out exactly what he's going to do for you. Now, the way I remember that, self-employed ends in an F, and that F is in for. Okay? Now, why is the important status important? Well, there is a table further on in our notes that explains exactly what's important, but as a general rule, an employee gets more rights than a self-employed person would do. And there are also tax consequences related to being an employee versus being a self-employed or an independent contractor. Now, we're going to look at the next table, and that summarises some of the key factors that have been taken into account by the courts when they've been asked to decide whether someone is self-employed or an independent contractor and whether they are an employee. Now, you have to be aware that the court's decisions come out slightly differently depending on whether they're looking at a tax case or whether they are looking at maybe a tort case, a negligence case or something like that. So just keeping that in mind, there is no hard and fast rule here. Now, these tests, the first three are given slightly more weight than the other tests. Now, in order to be an employee, you must have the relevant requirements under these first three tests. So these are your must-haves. The other tests are really more about evidence. They're factors to be taken into account. So quite often you'll see the examiner will give you a little scenario in a question where you have to decide whether someone is self-employed or not. And that scenario will include maybe a number of the later tests, but maybe one of these key tests. If that key test doesn't exist, isn't satisfied, your person cannot be an employee. If those three tests aren't there, that doesn't necessarily mean... if those three tests are there, that doesn't necessarily mean your person is an employee, although it's likely. It just means that you have to look at the other tests. So, those first three tests, first of all. Can the individual delegate? If you can delegate your job or your role at work, send somebody in instead of you to go to work tomorrow, then you are not an employee. You are going to be an independent contractor. We're not talking about, delegating to your assistant or something like that. We're talking about delegating to someone outside of that employment. Control. Now, control is here in this first three tests, and it also comes up again later on. Basically, there must be some control over the employee if they are to be treated as having an employee-employer relationship. It doesn't necessarily mean that they have to tell you every little thing about your job. There could be that they just have control over what you do generally and when you do it. Mutuality of obligations is a very important test. Now, this is about the duties owed by the employee to turn up and go to work every day, and also the duty owed by the employer to provide work and to pay the employee every day. So long as those duties are going both ways, we have mutuality of obligation. But as soon as they don't, let's draw some better arrows. As soon as they don't go both ways, then we don't have mutuality of obligations, and therefore you cannot be an employee. Now, the terms of the contract is also important, but it's only evidence. So, for instance, it's very easy to draw up an employment contract that says, for instance, that somebody will get sick pay or holiday pay, or maybe that just says, I am a self-employed person. But the courts will look behind that contract and to see what's actually happened. What is the reality of the situation? So a contract is evidence, but it's not conclusive. Now, a key issue that the courts have looked at is who takes the financial risk. If you think about it, if you are a self-employed person, then you are taking all the risks of your business. If there's a quiet spell and there's no work available, you won't get paid. If you invest in some plant and machinery to help you carry out your job and then you don't get a good return on that, that's your risk. However, if you are an employee, you would expect your employer to provide you with the tools of equipment to do your job, your computer maybe a company car, maybe some items of specialist equipment that you use. You would also expect your employer to be taking the financial risk because you will get your salary even if business is quiet. Even if your employer isn't paid for his contracts, you would expect that your employer would still pay you. The courts consider that employees are more likely to wear a uniform. Not a very important test there. More importantly, integration. Now, as well as control, so telling the employee what it is that you want them to do, there is another question, which is the employee integrated into the business? So for instance, if you are a self-employed person working in a particular premises, you'd probably take your own computer, you'd sit at a desk that you've borrowed maybe, and you just get on with your work quietly. But if you are integrated into the employer's business, perhaps you share the secretaries, you use the internal post system, you're set up on the internal email network, all those things suggest that you are integrated into that establishment and therefore is evidence that you are an employee. Linked to the contractual provisions is, do you pay tax and national insurance? Because how that's dealt with, again, can be evidence of your employment status. So for instance, if your employer deducts tax and national insurance under PAYE, that would suggest that there is an employment relationship. If, however, you deal with your own tax affairs under your self-assessment return, that would suggest that you are self-employed. The number of employments is important because independent contractors tend to work for quite a range of people. It's more unusual for an independent contractor to work exclusively for one person. Certainly, if you looked over a period of time, maybe over 12 months, you would expect an independent contractor to have a number of jobs. Now, that's not always conclusive. You could have a one-off contract to supply services for, say, 12 months or something like that. And if that can be justified in terms of that project, then that's fine. But generally, the higher the number of employments you've got, the more likely you are to be a self-employed person. And then finally, length of service. Now, you might start out as a self-employed person, an independent contractor, but over time, it's more likely that you'll become integrated into the organisation, and over time, the longer the relationship, the more likely you are to become an employee. So we can see from this worked example how these tests sort of weigh out together. So if we go through them all and identify which points might indicate self-employment, which tests might indicate an employee. So a builder's labourer paid his wages without deduction of tax or national insurance. So that suggests that he is self-employed. Calls himself self-employed. Well, again, that's evidence. It suggests he's self-employed. The person he does work for can dismiss him, can decide where he works and what sort of work he does, and also provides the tools he uses. Well, that all suggests that he's an employee, doesn't it? Now, let's assume that this particular employee wants to sue his employer, and the case turns on whether he really is an employee or whether he is a self-employed person. Now, in this particular case, we had two tests there that we identified that suggested that he was self-employed. However, the fact that the employer controls him, one of those key tests, remember, there's no mention here of mutuality of obligations or ability to delegate, so we can't really take that into account. But on balance, it looks like this person is really an employee. Now, the following question tests pretty much in the same way as the examiner will test your knowledge. Pause the recording and read this. Identify the tests going each way, remembering to give extra weight to those first three important tests and see what conclusion you reach. Okay, so what tests have we got? Let's check your answer. So, you saw a sign advertising vacancies, contacted the foreman and told that he would be required, but work depended on weather conditions. He'd work as and when required. That suggests that he is self-employed, doesn't it? Because that is the mutuality of obligations test. He wouldn't be given an employment contract. Well, that's not conclusive, but that's evidence again that he's self-employed. He was also told that he would be accountable for his own income tax and national insurance. Again, that's evidence of self-employment. And the foreman added that, like all his employees, he'd be provided with tools at the beginning of the day and would be told whether he'd be needed, and if so, which site he'd be working on each day. Well, that sentence, providing the tools, that's evidence of employment. Being told whether or not he would be needed, that's back to the mutuality of obligations test. And then there's an element of control there, which is evidence of employment, isn't there? Being told where he's got to work. So the question said, what is his legal status? Well, the key point here is that there was no mutuality of obligations, and that means that Charles cannot be an employee. So despite there being some tests, some of the lesser tests that lean towards that conclusion, that mutuality of obligations test is overriding. So Charles is not an employee. So why do we care? Well, I've already touched on some of the implications of being an employee versus being self-employed, but we just have a little summary table here to remind you. Some of these points we will go back to, and some of them we've actually already covered. So, wrongful dismissal is something we're going to look at later. That's something that's available to an employee, but not to a self-employed person. An employee, as I've already said, gets slightly better protection than a self-employed person. They get a minimum period of notice. They get statutory redundancy pay, and they're entitled to protection against unfair dismissal. Those are things which are not available to a self-employed person. If you're self-employed, you're basically governed by the terms of the contract that you drew up, the contract for services between yourself and your boss. Now, it says here an employee gets health and safety protection. Well, a self-employed person also gets some protection because he qualifies as a worker. And most of the European legislation dealing with protection of employees deals with the term workers, and that covers independent contractors as well as employees. So, for instance, the Working Time Directive and certainly some statutory health and safety obligations still apply to the self-employed. As I said earlier, you can't just, expose your staff to dangers just because they're self-employed and don't have that golden employment contract. Employees are slightly better position when a company becomes insolvent, because if your employer becomes insolvent, employees are preferential creditors, meaning they get paid ahead of a number of other creditors, particularly floating charge holders and ordinary creditors. If you are self-employed, you're an ordinary creditor, so you get no preferential rights. There are also terms that are implied by statute and also by common law into your employment contract. And although those terms might not be written into your actual employment contract, they can be enforced just as if they were. These don't apply for a self-employed person. Now, tort. We've already looked at tort. Remember, we've said that an employer is vicariously liable for the torts committed by his employees in the course of their employment. So if you're negligent at work, then it's not you that will be sued, it will be your employer who is liable. Now, although that can apply in a very rare set of circumstances for an independent contractor, it's pretty limited. So for the purposes of your exam, I would assume that it doesn't apply for self-employed people. As I've already said, tax is different. PAYE applies to an employee, and an employee would never have to register for VAT. But a self-employed person, they are responsible for their own tax when they submit their self-assessment, and they're also liable to register for VAT if they have crossed the VAT registration threshold. And also, they're liable for national insurance under Class 2 and Class 4. Employees are also liable for national insurance, but they're subject to Class 1. Now, the difference here is that employees' national insurance is much higher than the national insurance for a self-employed person. In particular, if an employer has employees, he must pay secondary Class 1 contributions, whereas there's no such contribution if you use independent contractors. Okay, so that's some of the basics there about the difference between being self-employed and employed. In the next chapter, next lecture, we're going to come back and try and look at some of these points in a little bit more detail. So I'll see you then.